chosen to go after Lentesta and Meow Wolf. So I will try very hard to be even half as cool as those two groups there, okay? So today we're going to talk about my paper. It's going to be published in just a couple of weeks, and I should warn you that this is a 10,000 word article. So I will try to give you as much as I can in the next 10 minutes. So this is a paper called The Prevalence of Storyworlds and Thematic Landscapes in Global Theme Parks. So just a bit of an overview here. I wanted to analyze kind of the prevalence of theming and storytelling. We talk a lot about its importance. I think anecdotally we discuss it quite frequently. But I wanted to kind of look at this empirically, is it actually there? So I looked at 77 top theme parks in 3 major regions. So let's see if I'm not as tall as Ken. So in North America, Asia, and Europe. And then essentially, how did I figure out what those 77 parks were? I looked at the our favorite report every year, Global Attractions Attendance Report, looked for the last 10 years and looked at what are the parks that are in the top 20 in each region, and that ended up being 77 parks. So maybe a little more than I thought. So over those 10 years, each year, it was anywhere between essentially like 260 to 360 million visitors per year. So looking at trying to figure out, how can we look at these concepts and then apply them into practice, and I think we kind of need to know the context for that. So I wanted to also extend the research on tourism, because some of you who know me know I have a bit of a humanities background where we talk about storytelling all the time, but we don't do that as much in tourism, so I wanted to do that, and then again kind of wanted to make it a bit more empirical. So looking at the methods, as I said, 77 parks, and then looking at those 10 years, and I wanted to talk about thematic content, because we always talk about theme park maybe somehow being different from an amusement park, and then also storytelling, and what do we mean by storytelling. So I want to go into a little more detail on that. So I think about theming. Any of you ever read that massive tome of David Younger's, the themed, the art of themed experience? So in that book, I really love the kind of distinction between the 2 different types of theming, where it's the manifestation theme or the dramatic theme. The dramatic theme being more that kind of literary perspective, the underlying message in a space. But then I would say more in the themed environment vernacular, we tend to go with that first one, right? Which is that is themed to pirates or something like that. So that is actually the one I chose for this study, just because I was looking at parks all around the world, and I didn't necessarily know all those languages, so I didn't know if I'd be able to kind of parse out that literary theme, so we went with the manifestation theme. So I looked at themed rides. I did choose rides that did not have stories, so I didn't do any overlap in these attractions. Then looked at themed lands, specifically ones that you could tell, again, what the theme was. And I was very excited to realize that we've really grown as an industry in terms of our iconography, in terms of figuring out what these theme zones are. I love this old map of Magic Kingdom. It very clearly delineates. They have, colored ground saying this is a theme, this is a theme, this is a theme. So I was really impressed by how easy this was for me to actually find all the themed lands in all these parks throughout the world. The next thing I looked at were the common themes. So there's several bits of literature on this. So we had Lee 2018, Millman 2001, and then Wang and Chang at 1999, which had all kind of already determined what were the common themes. So I wanted to look at what's the current state of the industry in terms of those common themes. So what I looked for here, adventure, exotic, your kind of jungle motif, characters and media, which is your IP-based lands, but these are not the ones where you kind of immerse in those lands. Instead, most of the theming is just here's the characters rather than in that immersive environment. Culture and place, where it's actually supposed to represent a particular place, and I was amazed to find culture place themes for every region in the world, so we're quite interested in this idea. I always think kind of the core of our industry is you're in a different world, and in this case we found tons of these other worlds. Fantasy and magic and future and sci-fi, which I think are rather self-explanatory. Hollywood and movies, which is not the immersive landscape, but instead the you're in a movie studio theme. Nature and sea, which was more common than I thought it was, lots of stuff about nature. And then no theme, which either meant there was no specific theme that they meant, or it was a amalgam of a mess, I would say, of stuff that I couldn't really figure it out. So we're going with no theme on that one. So looking at the next thing, which is storytelling. So storytelling, I hope we have a few hours. Okay, yeah, exactly. But I did want to look at the different kinds of presentation of narrative, because I think we don't, again, kind of go into this enough, we don't analyze this enough. What are these spaces actually using in terms of narrative presentation style? So your explicit storytelling is your direct storytelling, usually through narration of some sort. So this could be a person, it could be an animatronic, it could be media. And then sometimes also just written text, which we can use for explicit. Implicit storytelling is basically the everything else, your environmental storytelling, using props or lighting or animatronics, figures, whatever. And then looking at a narrative ride, and so for narrative ride, where's my friend Joel Zika? Hello. So I thought that the dark ride in this particular study was absolutely the best choice in terms of coming up with a narrative ride, but I did see other types of rides. I was surprised we've really gotten to a spot where even several thrill rides and roller coasters are getting into the narrative game, but I still think dark rides were the most prevalent in terms of these things. So what did we figure out? So again, I could probably talk a long time about this. Again, if you want to read the paper, let me know. But what we found out is that theming was everywhere. It was absolutely pervasive in those 77 parks. I also did something where I broke it up into tiers. So I think we all know as people who work in and study the industry that Disney and Universal have a very different capital level than all the rest of the parks. So I thought it was fair to kind of break it into the tiers. So, but the tier 1 parks, which are your Disney Universal, which are essentially parks that have an average visitation of 11.75 million or 11.7 million, and then an average value of 7.5 billion. This is your tier 1 parks. And I did find that though all of the tiers had these things, this was definitely, if you're in a tier 1, you're going to have every one of the categories in my whole study. So I thought that was kind of interesting as well. But you can still see it's an absolute majority. So looking at the actual themes, this ended up yielding a lot more interesting things than I thought would be determined. So first of all, 77 parks. We had 485 different lands. So I didn't realize there'd be quite so many lands, but that's how many lands we had in those 77 parks. And of that, about 90% or 433 of them did have a clear specified theme. So that was actually even more than I thought. If you notice that, it's kind of hard to see with the light so bright, but if you notice that light gray line, culture and place was by far the most prevalent of every theme, and I was not expecting that. I think when we think of theme parks, we might think more of the, I don't know, fantasy or Hollywood or something like that. No, it definitely was culture place. What was also interesting to determine was of the culture place, the regions where these lands were most likely to have culture place for that region. So in other words, in Asia, had the most amount of Asia-themed lands. In Europe, were the most amount of Europe-themed lands. So I thought this was quite interesting as well. I also found it fascinating because future and sci-fi and Hollywood and movies were by far the least common themes. So I think we can comment on this, my own kind of guess. I haven't really done much theory yet on this, but I think Hollywood movies were kind of moving away from the kind of artificial, explicitly artificial paradigm to the immersive paradigm. That's just a guess. And then maybe future, I think of, we've realized it's really hard to depict the future in physical space. We might have to keep updating it, so that's that. And then there was a lot of regional variation. So you can tell just from this chart that, for instance, Adventure Exotic, we're not as interested in that theme in North America. So just a couple of things I found. When it comes to storytelling, I was very pleased to say, because any of my students, I have several students in the room, they know that I'm a little bit obsessed with the idea of, no, storytelling is really, really important. And I was right, you know, and now I have done this scientific study to prove that I am right. Okay. So both implicit and explicit storytelling were quite common, and I was pleased to see that at least one of them was included in absolutely every single park. So that was there. Now, ride-through narratives were less common than I thought. They're still quite common. So then I had to kind of dig deep into the parks that didn't have a ride-through narrative, and I found that, it's because several of those parks are in fact not ride parks. So Puy du Fou doesn't have a ride-through narrative because they have one single ride, which is a children's carousel, right? And then Soonchong, which is a really great kind of immersive environment chain of parks in China, does not emphasize rides. So I found that of my whole study, there were maybe, I think, 3 parks in the entire study that didn't have a ride-through narrative that was a park with rides. So it was very common, so I was excited to see that. All right, so in summary of my 10,000 word paper, Storyworlds and Thematic Landscapes are key aspects for success, and there's a lot of literature on what the other aspects of success are in theme parks. There's a lot of important things on the operational side, on the capital side, but we haven't talked enough about this, so I thought it would be interesting to go through and actually find the presence of this stuff. And if you look at those top parks in the world by attendance, you'll see that they have these elements. I do think this contributes to the literature on theming and storytelling, especially in tourism, where again it hasn't been as common a discussion until fairly recently. And then one thing I found very interesting is that the operators that are not on those top lists right now, they can kind of strategically add theme lands and storytelling. And I just recently went this summer to Wallaby, Belgium, which ended up being a case in this because they have very strategically said, we want to eventually get to 2 million visitors, so they're not on the list now, they eventually want to get there. So how are we going to do this? And it was investment in storytelling and themed land. So Martin, have you been on Conda yet?
No, but I've been on the popcorn ride.
Oh yeah, Popcorn Revenge is great, Challenge of Tutankhamun, but specifically Conda is a brand new roller coaster, and they've made it a point to make it in a themed land, have a backstory and things like that. So even those smaller operators that might want to start breaking into those ranks of higher visitation and revenue, they can utilize these strategies as well. And because I see so many researchers in the room, I hope some of you will eventually join me and realize how cool storytelling and theming would be as a topic for your future research. So thank you very much. That is my email. Feel free to email me if you want.
We have time for one more question.
So this is cool because you're familiar with this both on the university side and the theme park side, but one of the other location-based experiences is school. We're studying amusement park design in relation to education, and I'm curious about the idea of theming campuses and long-term themed experiences, and when it is or is not appropriate to break the fourth wall as your cast members become maybe teachers or educators in a story that takes you through a long-term educational experience.
Yeah, I love that, and actually we could talk for a long time about this, but what I have found, especially when I was doing the literature review for this paper, is we are kind of starting to expect theming everywhere in a way we never had before. But I will end with one anecdote from my own class. I taught a Harry Potter class. It was very cool. And what I found was that the students started self-theming. So we broke them into house, because you got to do that, right? It's Hogwarts, of course. But what I noticed is as we went through, they kept believing the story more and more. And so they started wearing robes to class, they started bringing wands to class. And I don't know if there's any Slytherins in the house. I'm Ravenclaw all the way, but you know, yeah. Okay, we could go a whole different direction with this conference now, right? But the Slytherin house, I don't know what it was, but they started saying, well, we're going to be in charge of potions. So they started bringing potions to class. And every week, more and more potions were arriving. So by the end of this class, we were in a full themed environment, and this was all something based on the students were able to suspend disbelief and just really get into the storyline that they were Hogwarts students. So yeah, good stuff. So thank you so much.